Chapter 2. Though Zolana would not have admitted it, even to herself, her life was much more pleasant now that she had Illyria to love and to care for. Since Illyria was able to find her own food, and she had playmates enough to keep her occupied, her presence in the grotto in the evenings was hardly any inconvenience at all. Zolana was still able to create poetry and compose music, and Illyria served as a ready-made audience. She loved to have Zolana sing to her, and she seemed to enjoy listening to the recitation of Zolana's poems, even though she didn't understand a single word. She was now well into her 6th year, but she continued to speak exclusively in the squeaking, piping language of the dolphins. Zolana considered this. It wasn't really all that much of a problem, since she herself was also fluent in that language. She decided, though, that perhaps one of these days she might teach the young one the rudiments of the language she spoke and shared with her sister and her brothers. It shouldn't be too difficult. Zolana had discovered that Illyria was very quick. As it turned out, however, Illyria was about 2 jumps ahead of her. Zolana had been reciting poetry to the child since Illyria's infancy, and one day in the early autumn of Illyria's 6th year, Zolana happened to overhear the child reciting one of the poems to her playmates, translating each line into their own language as she went along. Zolana's poetry took on whole new dimensions when delivered in the squeaks and bubbles of the dolphin language. Zolana was fairly sure that the young dolphins weren't really all that interested in poetry, but Illyria's habit of rewarding their attention with kisses and embraces kept them obediently in place. Zolana was very fond of dolphins herself, but the notion of kissing them had never occurred to her. Illyria, however, seemed to have discovered early in her life that dolphins would do almost anything for kisses. Zolana decided at that point that it might not be a bad idea to start paying closer attention to the progress of the young child. Lately, it seemed that every time she turned around, Illyria had a new surprise for her. "Illyria," she said a bit later when the 2 of them were alone in the grotto. Illyria responded with a squeaky little dolphin sound. "Speak in words, child," Zolana commanded. Illyria stared at her in astonishment. "It is not proper that I should be loved," she replied quite formally. "Thy speech is not to be used for mundane purposes or ordinary times. It is reserved for stately utterances. I would not for all this world profane it by reducing its stature to the commonplace." Zolana immediately realized where she had blundered. In a peculiar sort of way, she treated Illyria in much the same way the child was now treating her dolphin playmates. Illyria had been something on the order of a captive audience, but not quite completely captive. The child had drawn her own conclusions. There was a certain logic behind Illyria's conviction that Zolana's language was reserved for poetry alone, since the only times when Zolana had spoken that language to her had been during those recitations. Ordinary conversations between them had been in the language of the dolphins. "Come here, child," Zolana said. "I think it's time for us to get to know each other a bit better." Illyria seemed apprehensive. "Have I done something wrong, beloved?" she asked. "Are you angry with me because I told your poems to the finned ones? You didn't want me to do that, did you? Your poems were love, and they were for me alone. Now I've spoiled them." Illyria's eyes filled with tears. "Please don't make me go away, beloved," she wailed. "I promise that I won't do it again." A wave of emotion swept over Zolana, and she felt her own eyes clouding over. She held out her arms to the child. "Come to me," she said. Illyria rushed to her, and they clung to each other. Both of them were weeping now, yet they were filled with a kind of joy. Zolana and Illyria spent all of their time together in the grotto after that. The dolphins brought fish for Ilaria to eat, and the trickling spring provided water, so there was no real need for the child to go out into Mother Sea. Her playmates were a bit sulky at first, but that soon passed. Zalana spent many happy hours teaching Ilaria how to create poetry and how to sing. Zalana's poetry was stately and formal, and her songs were complex. Ilaria's poetry was still of a more ancient form, but much more passionate, and her songs were simple and pure. Zalana was painfully aware that the child's voice, clear and reaching upward without effort, was more beautiful than her own. Ilaria eventually came to realize that the language she had come to know as the language of poetry had a much more colloquial form, which they could use for everyday communication. She still insisted on calling Zalana beloved, however. It was the autumn of Ilaria's 7th year when the child went out to play with her pink friends again. Zalana had suggested that Ilaria had been neglecting them of late, and it was not really polite to do that. Late that day, Ilaria returned to the grotto with a strange glowing object. "What is that pretty thing, child?" Zalana asked. "It is called a pearl, beloved," Ilaria replied, "and a very old friend of the dolphins gave it to me. Well, she didn't actually give it to me. She showed me where it was, though." "I didn't know that pearls could grow so large," Zalana marveled. "It must have been an enormous oyster." "It was huge, beloved." "Who is this friend of the dolphins?" "A whale," Ilaria replied. "She was very old, and she lives near the Isle of the South Coast. She joined us this morning and told me that she wanted to show me something. Then she led me to the islet and took me down to where this enormous oyster was attached to a reef. The oyster shell was almost as wide across as I am tall." "How did you pry it open if it was that big?" "I didn't have to, beloved. The old whale touched the shell with her fin, and the oyster opened itself for us." "How very peculiar," Zalana said. The old whale told me that the oyster wanted me to have the pearl, so I took it. I did thank the oyster, but I'm not sure it could understand me. It was a little hard to swim and hold my pearl at the same time, but the old whale offered to carry me back home." "Carry?" "Well, not exactly. I rode on her back." "That is so much fun." Ilaria held the pearl up. "See how it glows pink, beloved? It's even prettier than the ceiling of our grotto." She nestled her pearl, which was about the size of an apple, against her cheek. "I love it," she declared. "Did you eat today?" Zalana asked. "I had plenty earlier today, beloved. My friends and I found a school of herring and ate our fill." "Did the whale have a name by any chance?" "The dolphins just called her Mother. She isn't really their mother, of course. I think it's more like a way to let her know that they love her." "She speaks the same language as the dolphins?" "Sort of. Her voice isn't as squeaky, though." Ilaria crossed to her bed of moss. "I'm very tired, beloved," she said, sinking down onto her bed. "It was a long swim out to the islet, and Mother Whale swims faster than I do. So even though she slowed down, I had trouble keeping up with her." "Why don't you go to sleep then, Ilaria? I'm sure you'll feel much better in the morning." "That sounds like a terribly good idea, beloved," Ilaria said. "I'm really having trouble keeping my eyes open." She lay back on her bed of moss with the glowing pink pearl cradled to her heart. Zalana was puzzled and just a trifle concerned. It wasn't really natural for whales and dolphins to associate with each other in the way Ilaria had just described, and Zalana was almost positive that they wouldn't be able to speak to each other and be understood. Something very peculiar had happened today. Ilaria appeared to be sound asleep now, and her limbs had relaxed. Then, to Zalana's astonishment, the glowing pink pearl rose up into the air above the sleeping child. Its pink glow grew steadily stronger, and the glow seemed to enclose Illyria. "Don't interfere, Zelana," a very familiar voice echoed in Zelana's mind. "This is necessary, and I don't need any help from you." Illyria awoke somewhat later than usual the following morning, and she had a somewhat puzzled look on her face as she sat cross-legged on her bed of moss with her pearl in her hand. "Why do we sleep, beloved?" she asked. "I don't," Zelana replied, "and I'm not sure exactly why other creatures seem to need to sleep every so often." "I thought you and I were of the same kind," Illyria said. "We look very much alike, except that your hair is dark and glossy, and mine is sort of yellow." "I've wondered about that myself. Maybe I've just outgrown the need for sleep. I am quite a bit older than you are, after all." It was a simplified answer, but Zelana was quite certain that Illyria wasn't quite ready for the real one just yet. "Since you don't sleep, you wouldn't know about the strange things I seem to see happening when I'm asleep, would you?" "They're called dreams, Illyria," Zelana told her, "and I don't think any other creature has the same kind of dreams you do. My brother Deline told me that your dreams would be very special and much more important than the dreams of the ordinaries. Did you have a dream last night that frightened you?" "It didn't particularly frighten me, beloved. It just seemed very strange for some reason." "Why don't you tell me about it?" Zelana suggested. "Well, I seemed to be floating, except that I wasn't floating in Mother Sea the way I do sometimes when I want to rest and catch my breath. I was floating way up in the air instead, and all sorts of strange things were happening far below. Father Earth seemed to be all on fire, and his mountains were rising and falling, the way Mother Sea's waves do. Rocks were melting and running down the sides of some of Father Earth's mountains into Mother Sea, and some of his other mountains were spouting liquid fire way up into the sky." "Could something like that really happen?" "Yes, child," Zelana said in a troubled voice, "and it happened in exactly the way you just described. I was there watching while it happened. It was at the very beginning of the world." "What happened next?" "Well, the fires kept burning for a long, long time, and then the land below me started to break apart, and the pieces floated off in different directions. Then trees began to sprout on the face of Father Earth, and Mother Sea started having children. It was along about then that I seemed to know that I wasn't alone. Others were having the same dream, only maybe for them it wasn't really a dream." Zelana smiled. "No, dear, it wasn't. I was one of those others, and I certainly wasn't dreaming, and neither were my brother or my sister." "Then it was your family that was sort of hiding around the edges of my dream," Illyria said. "I thought you only had 2 brothers and 1 sister." "There seemed to be 2 more brothers and a sister watching with me." "They're another branch of the family tree, Illyria," Zelana told her. "We don't get together very often. We can talk about them some other time. Why don't you tell me what happened next in your dream? Dreams fade, I understand, and I'd like to hear your whole dream before you forget." "Well, most of Mother Sea's children were fish, but some of them weren't. Those were the ones who crawled up onto the face of Father Earth. They sort of looked like snakes at first, but then they sprouted legs, and they grew up to be very big. Some of them ate trees, but some of the others ate the ones who were eating trees. Then a great big rock that was on fire fell down out of the sky, and when it hit Father Earth, it made an awful splash, except that it was rock that splashed instead of water, and everything got dark for a long time. It finally started to get light again, but the snakes with legs weren't there anymore." "Did my relatives go away too?" "Some of them went to sleep, but they woke up after a while, and the ones who stayed awake went to sleep. There was one that never slept, though. That one's very ugly, isn't he? Indeed it is, child, Zelana replied with a shudder. It is an outcast, and we don't even like to think about it. What happened next? There were a lot of things with fur wandering around, and there were birds and bugs, too. But then some things who walked on their hind legs came along. They didn't look at all the way we do, though. Their skin was scaly like the skin of large fish, or maybe snakes, and their eyes were huge and stuck way out in front of their faces. They went on for quite a long time, and then everything was all covered with white, and it got very cold. Mother Sea seemed to shrink, and she ran away from her shore. Then the white went away, and Mother Sea came back. That's when the man-things who looked like me arrived. They didn't look exactly like me, though. They wrapped themselves up in animal skins for some reason, and you and I don't do that, do we? It isn't necessary for us, Ilaria. The skins help the man-things stay warm, and they're ashamed of their bodies. How peculiar, Ilaria said, frowning slightly. That was about all there was, beloved, except that the awful-looking watcher was still way off at the edge of my dream, and I don't think it likes me very much. I get the feeling that it's afraid of me for some reason. If it has anything like good sense, it is. Do you think you'll be able to manage here by yourself for a few days? There are some things I need to attend to. I won't really be gone for long. Can I go with you? I'm afraid not, Ilaria. I have to go by myself this time. Maybe you can come along next time. We'll see.